The billionaire who tried to build a second Perth. Yanchep Sun City. In the early 1970s, one of Australia's richest and most famous businessmen stood on a stretch of empty dunes about an hour north of Perth and announced that he was going to build a second city there. Alan Bond called it Yanchep Sun City, and it was to be a metropolis in its own right, a self-contained satellite city for as many as 250,000 people, rising out of the coastal scrub as Western Australia's answer to the Gold Coast. He cut a marina into the coast. He built a marine park with performing dolphins and a 10-metre statue of King Neptune staring out to sea. And then, one piece at a time, the whole dream came apart. Bond would go on to win the America's Cup and be made a national hero, and then to lose everything and go to prison as the author of the largest corporate fraud the country had ever seen. But by the time his empire collapsed, Yanchep was no longer even his. The city that was meant to be his monument had been sold off years before, and what it left on that coast was not a metropolis, but a ruin. A dolphin park, rotting behind its fences, a King Neptune slowly disappearing under graffiti, and a town that waited half a century for the city it had been promised. The strangest part is that the city is finally coming. The trains, the suburbs, the people, arriving 50 years late, and with the billionaire's name on none of it. This is the story of Sun City, the second Perth that never happened, and the ruins the tycoon left behind on the sand. Chapter 1. The Reed in the Dunes. Before the dream there was the country, and the country had a name long before it had a developer. About 56 kilometres north of Perth, where the coastal plain gives out into low limestone dunes and shallow wetlands, lies a stretch of country the Noongar people have held for thousands of years. This is Whadjuk Noongar country, near its northern edge, where it runs up toward the land of the Yuid people beyond. A border drawn by custom rather than survey, and one it is not for an outsider to fix too precisely. What is certain is older than any line on a map. People have lived here and known this coast across a span of time that no city plan could ever hold in its head. The place still carries their word for itself. Yanchep comes from the Noongar Yanget, the name of the bulrush reed that grew thick and green around the freshwater wetlands behind the dunes, a plant gathered and worked and used, growing wherever the water sat, sweet a little way in from the salt. To name a place for the reed at its heart is to know it in a way a brochure never will. The lagoon, the reed beds, the caves in the soft limestone underground, the fresh water held in the dune country behind the beach. These were not features waiting to be discovered. They were a place already fully inhabited, mapped in language and in memory, worked and understood across more generations than the men who came later could begin to count. That custodianship has not ended. It is not a thing of the past tense, closed off and finished before the story proper begins. The Whadjuk Noongar are here still, and the country is still theirs in the reckoning that matters most to them, whatever titles have since been drawn over the top of it. What changed when the surveyors and then the developers arrived was not the presence of people on the land, but the way outsiders chose to see it as raw ground, unwritten, waiting for a plan. Some of what the country held was set aside early and survived on its own terms. The caves and the lagoon and the freshwater lake in the dunes became, decades before there was any talk of a city, a national park, Loch McNess, Crystal Cave, the reed-fringed water and the limestone caverns beneath it, a place people came to walk and to wonder at, and one that would still be there long after grander schemes had come and gone. The reed country had value, in other words, without anyone having to invent a metropolis to give it some. It was already a destination. It was already a home. But value of that kind does not show up on a balance sheet, and it was a balance sheet that would decide what happened here next. To a certain eye, the eye of a man measuring frontage and acreage, and the distance to a growing capital down the coast, the dunes above Perth read as something else entirely. Empty. Empty of houses, empty of streets, empty of everything a developer counts as use, kilometre after kilometre of pale sand and low scrub and grey-green heath. Running along a coast the city had not yet reached, with nobody selling it and nobody, it seemed, standing in the way. It was not empty land. It only looked empty to the men who came to sell it. Behind the beach, the reeds still grew where the water lay sweet in the wetlands that had given the whole place its name 1,000 years and more before anyone thought to draw a city over the top of them. A green stand of bulrush in the dunes, waiting as it had always waited for the next high season of rain. Chapter 2. The Signwriter. The man who would try to build a city in those dunes did not begin with cities. He began with a brush. Alan Bond had come to Western Australia as a boy, a migrant out of London set down on the far side of the world, and he started working life at the bottom of it, a signwriter, up a ladder with a pot of paint, lettering the shop fronts and the windows of other men's businesses. It is worth holding that picture a moment because everything that came after is measured against it. The richest and most famous years of the man's life began with a teenager painting somebody else's name onto somebody else's glass. He did not stay on the ladder. The signwriting became a business of its own. And that business became the seed of something far larger, because Bond had understood early the thing that would drive him for the rest of his life. That the real money was not in the paint, but in the property the paint was hung on. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, he moved from lettering land to owning it, and then to carving it up and selling it on. Perth in those years was a city loosening at its edges, spreading out along its river and its coast, and a man with nerve and an eye for a subdivision could ride that spread a long way. Bond rode it further than most. What set him apart was not simply appetite, though the appetite was real. It was scale. Other developers bought a block, or a street, or a paddock on the fringe, and turned it over for a margin. Bond thought in larger units, whole estates, whole tracts, schemes big enough that the doing of them changed the map. He was self-made in the purest and most restless sense of the phrase, not a man born to money and working to keep it, but a man who had started with nothing and could not stop adding to the pile, less for the wealth itself than for the size of the thing the wealth let him make. He wanted to build large enough to be seen from the air. That temperament would carry him in time far beyond property, into brewing, into media, into the yachting that made him a national name. And it would carry him, in the end, into ruin and a prison cell. But all of that was still years off. In the 1960s, he was simply a developer, if an unusually bold one. By the close of the decade, one of the most ambitious builders in Western Australia, a self-made tycoon whose empire, before it was finished, would be counted in the billions, and who was already too big, in his own estimation, for the ordinary business of blocks and streets. He needed a canvas the size of his idea of himself. A single suburb would not do it. A single suburb is a thing you finish and move on from. What Bond wanted was something that would stand as a statement, a place with his stamp on it large enough to be unarguable, the kind of thing a man points to for the rest of his life and says, plainly, that he made it. Perth to the south was already built, already spoken for. Its good land held and its story half told. There was no room there for a monument. So he looked north, past the last of the built-up coast, past the point where the suburbs gave out and the road ran into scrub, to the long, empty run of dunes above the city, the reed country, the pale sand and grey heath that read, to a man with a balance sheet and a vision, as the one thing Perth could not offer him: room. Room enough, he thought, to build not a suburb but a whole city. Room enough, on that patient stretch of coast, to build a second Perth. Chapter 3. A second Perth. The buying came first, and it came quietly. In 1969 and 1970, before there was a name or a slogan or a single line of publicity, Bond's company went to a single pastoral concern, the Widgie Pastoral Company, which had run stock on the coast north of Perth, and bought its land, some 19,600 acres of it, a piece of country the size of a small shire, changing hands in the undramatic way that grazing land changes hands. On the day the papers were signed, it was still what it had always been. Low dune and heath and old sheep run. What it was to become existed as yet only in the mind of the man who had bought it. Then, in April of 1972, he told the world what that was. It was not a suburb. It was not a resort or a subdivision or a holiday strip, though it would be sold with the sunshine of all three. What Alan Bond announced, on a stretch of coast an hour north of the state capital, was a second city, Yanchep Sun City, a self-contained satellite metropolis with its own centre, its own harbour, its own reason to exist, planned from empty sand to hold, in time, as many as 250,000 people. The figure is worth pausing on. 250,000 is not an estate. It is a rival to the capital down the road. The number that carried it was as large. Yanchep Sun City was announced as a scheme of $250 million, an enormous sum for its day, the price not of a housing tract, but of a city built whole from nothing. And it was sold from the first on a single seductive comparison. This would be Western Australia's own Gold Coast, the state's answer to the golden, high-rise Sunshine Coast rising on the far side of the continent. A year-round playground of beach and marina and warm weather close enough to Perth to draw its people north and complete enough to keep them once they came. It arrived, as such visions do, on paper first, and the paper was magnificent. There were master plans and artists' impressions and brochures, a whole city rendered in perfect, confident detail. The streets laid out, the town centre drawn, the harbour sketched blue and full of boats, the population penciled in. You could hold the finished city in your two hands in glossy print years before a single street of it was poured. That was the peculiar genius and the peculiar danger of the thing. The plan was total. It answered every question except the one that matters, which is whether any of it will actually be built. For a while, though, the plan was enough. Land at Yanchep Sun City sold on the strength of the drawings, buyers taking in good faith a block on a map of a city that did not yet exist, trusting that the rest of the map would fill in around them. The first houses went up in 1972. The salesman spoke of the metropolis to come as though it were already half arrived, and in the mood of the early 1970s, with Perth booming and money loose, and the whole west of the country feeling like a frontier that would only ever grow, it was easy to believe them. Bond believed it himself, which was always his gift and his flaw in equal measure. He did not sell a lie so much as sell a future at full price before it existed. And so, for a season, two Yancheps ran side by side without anyone needing to choose between them. There was the Reed country coast, still mostly sand and scrub, and the beginnings of a few streets. And there was the other Yanchep, the true one as far as the brochures were concerned. A shining, finished 250,000 city, complete in every rendered detail, existing nowhere on Earth except in glossy print and in the mind of the man who had drawn it over the top of the dunes. Chapter 4, Cutting the Coast. The first thing Bond built at Yanchep was not a house, it was a harbour. Before the streets filled in, before the town centre rose, before any real weight of population arrived to justify it, his crews went to the coast at Two Rocks and began to cut a marina straight into it, dredging a basin and a run of canals out of the dune and the soft coastal limestone, hard against the open sea. It was a bold way to start a city, building the boats a harbour before building the town that would sail from it, and it announced in raw engineering the scale of the thing intended. A marina of that size is not built for a village, it is built for the metropolis on the brochure. There was a second reason for the harbour, and it belonged less to the city than to the man. Two Rocks, with its new basin and its deep-cut water, became the base from which Bond built and trained his first challenger for the America's Cup. The sailing obsession that would, a decade on, make him a national hero. Long before any of that glory, the marina at Yanchep did double duty, a selling point for the coming city and a working boatyard for the yacht in which its builder meant to beat the Americans. The two ambitions, the city and the cup, were poured into the same stretch of coast from the very start. It is worth being exact about this because the two would forever be spoken of in the same breath and were never the same place. The cup itself would be won and lost far from here. Two Rocks was only ever where the boats were made. Around the harbour, the beginnings of the town did appear. Subdivisions were opened, first at Yanchep Lagoon, then at Two Rocks, and the first houses went up on them, and a shopping centre came to serve the people who bought in. For a time, it had the look of a place genuinely being born. Surveyed streets, fresh curbs, show homes, the machinery of a suburb grinding into life on the edge of the sand. To a buyer standing on a new block with the sea in view, the second Perth must have felt close enough to reach out and touch. But the city on the brochure and the city on the ground were already quietly coming apart. What was drawn was a metropolis of 250,000. What was built was a marina, a scatter of houses, a shopping centre, and a great deal of sand still waiting for streets that were slow to come. The plan assumed a rate of growth that the reality never matched. People did buy and did build and did move north, but in their hundreds, not their hundreds of thousands, and never fast enough to bend the empty coast into the shape of the drawings. Then the ground shifted under the whole enterprise. When the Western Australian property market turned down in 1974, the sales that were meant to fund the city as it rose began to stall, and a scheme built on the assumption of endless, accelerating demand found the demand simply gone. Bond, characteristically, was stretched thin. Too many ventures running at once, too much borrowed against futures that had not yet arrived. And Yanchep, vast and expensive and years from paying its own way, was among the heaviest things he was carrying when the market turned. The marina, though, was real. It had been cut, and it stayed cut. A permanent harbour dredged into a coast that had never had one. What surrounded it stayed small. A modest town where a great city had been promised. A handful of streets where 250,000 people were one day meant to live. The harbour held its water and its few boats. Beyond it, kilometre after kilometre, the dunes that were to have become a second Perth stayed exactly what the Noongar had always known them to be. Reed and heath and pale, patient sand. Chapter 5. King Neptune's Kingdom. If the city would not come fast enough, the spectacle could. The metropolis of 250,000 people was still, a decade after it had been announced, mostly a set of lines on a plan. The houses were few, the streets ran out into scrub, and the great migration up the coast had not begun. But a spectacle could be built in a season and opened on a single day, and a spectacle could bring the crowds that the city could not yet keep. So the men who ran Yanchep turned the coast at Two Rocks into a stage. In June of 1981, 7 wild bottlenose dolphins were caught from the sea off that very coast, taken from the water they had been born in, and brought into a set of pools built to hold them. 6 months later, on Boxing Day, the 26th of December, 1981, the park those pools belonged to opened its gates. It was called Atlantis Marine Park, and it was built around the dolphins, around the sight of wild animals made to leap and turn and carry their trainers through the water, performing to a grandstand of families who had driven up from Perth for the day. And above the pools, above the whole of it, rose the thing the place would be remembered by. At the centre of Atlantis stood a King Neptune of about 10 metres, a sea god built to a scale that made the people beneath him look like the small creatures of his court. He held a trident in his hand and stared out over the ocean, a steel frame clad in concrete and limestone, raised by an American sculptor to preside over the kingdom that had been invented around him. He did not stand alone. Around him the sculptor and his crews had set a company of lesser figures, other ocean gods and great faces rising out of the coastal scrub, so that a visitor came not upon a single statue, but upon a whole mythology built in concrete on a beach. For a few years it worked exactly as it was meant to. The crowds came up the coast in their thousands to watch the dolphins and to stand in the shadow of the giant god. And for its brief season, Atlantis was the brightest thing on that whole stretch of coast, brighter certainly than the half-built town around it. It was marketed as a wonder, and for a while it was received as one. A marine park with a mythical kingdom built over it. A place that promised, in the leaping of the dolphins and the raised trident of the god, that the city behind it was real and coming and worth the drive. That was the point of it. Neptune was never only a statue. He was an advertisement, a 10-metre argument in concrete that Yanchep Sun City was a place where wonders were built and the future had already arrived. The dolphins were the draw and the god was the emblem, and together they were meant to do what the streets and the empty house blocks could not, to make people believe in the city by showing them the marvel at its edge. For a handful of summers the belief held, and the turnstiles turned, and the god looked out over a car park full of cars. But a kingdom raised to sell a city is only as real as the show that fills it. The dolphins were wild animals in a set of concrete pools. The god was a frame of steel under a skin of limestone. And the city the whole spectacle had been built to advertise was still, out beyond the fences, mostly sand. For its brief height, Atlantis was a genuine marvel, a mythical kingdom conjured on an empty coast, and at the heart of it stood a king of the sea, about 10 meters tall, trident in hand, staring out over an ocean that for a few short summers actually brought him the crowds he had been built to command. Chapter 6. Glory and the Mirage. While Neptune stood over the coast at Yanchep, the man whose money had raised him was reaching for a larger glory still, and reaching for it on the water. Alan Bond had chased the America's Cup for the better part of a decade, mounting challenge after challenge, and losing each of them, pouring money and pride into the oldest and most stubborn trophy in world sport. The Cup had never once left the United States. For 132 years, the New York Yacht Club had held it, turning back every challenger who came, until beating the Americans for the Cup had become a thing that simply was not done. On the 26th of September, 1983, it was done. Off Newport, in the American state of Rhode Island, on the far side of the world from the coast where his sea god stood, Bond's yacht, Australia 2, beat the American defender and took the Cup. 132 years of American possession ended in an afternoon on the water, and it ended at the hands of a boat flying an Australian burgee, paid for by the developer of Yanchep Sun City. It was, and remains, one of the great days in the country's sporting history. The first time in the whole life of the Cup that it had ever been prized out of American hands. Bond became a national hero overnight. He was the larrikin tycoon who had beaten the Americans at their own game, on their own water, in the contest they had owned since before Australia was even a nation. A whole country stayed up through the night to watch the finish and woke to celebrate the man who had won it. For a few years around 1983, he was as famous and as admired as any man in the country, the migrant signwriter who had made himself rich and then made himself immortal, the builder of cities and the winner of the Cup. But there is a quiet truth beneath the glory, and it belongs to this story more than the triumph does. The victory at Newport was fixed forever to Bond's name, and Yanchep was fixed to that name too, the coast he had made his own, the marina where his earlier challenges had been built. And yet, on the day Australia 2 crossed the line, Yanchep was no longer his. The city he had announced with such noise in 1972, the second Perth, the kingdom with the sea god at its edge, had already slipped quietly out of his hands, sold off in the middle of his troubles years before the afternoon that made him a hero. The public did not know it, and had no reason to look. The name Bond and the place Yanchep were still spoken in the same breath. The brochures had gone out under his name, the marina had been cut on his orders, the giant Neptune had been raised on his account. To the country cheering him in 1983, he was still the man who was building a whole city on the coast north of Perth. But the deeds had changed hands. The man being celebrated as the owner of the future no longer owned the piece of it that had carried his name the longest, and almost no one noticed the gap between the story and the fact. That is the mirage at the center of the glory. The triumph was real, the boat and the cup and the ending of 132 years. And the city behind him was already gone, held now by other hands and run to other ends. Bond stood on the deck at Newport as the man who had everything, cheered by a nation holding the oldest trophy in sport. And back on the coast north of Perth, his sea god looked out over a kingdom that, whatever the crowds believed, no longer belonged to the man who had built it. Chapter 7. The Handoff. The trouble had come early, and it had come from overreach. Yanchep Sun City was enormous. 19,600 acres of coast, a marina cut out of the limestone, a marine park, a whole metropolis to be paid for years before it could ever pay for itself. And Bond was carrying it alongside a dozen other schemes, stretched thin across all of them. When the Western Australian property market turned down in 1974, the ground went out from under him. The buyers he had counted on did not come. The houses did not sell at the rate the plan required, and a city built on the promise of a coming population began, quietly to cost far more than it returned. Into that gap came a company from the other side of the world. Tokyo, a Japanese concern, took a stake in Yanchep in the middle of the 1970s, buying into a scheme its founder could no longer carry alone. And over the next few years, it went further, until by the late 1970s, it had bought Alan Bond out of Yanchep altogether, taking his remaining share for a few $1 million and leaving him on the coast that still bore his mark with nothing. It is worth being exact about what this was, because it is easy to mistake. This was not the famous Japanese money of the late 1980s boom, the tide of capital that would later wash over Australian property and recede as fast as it had come. It was a decade earlier than that, and it was a different thing entirely. A rescue, not a speculation. Tokyo did not come to Yanchep at the height of a bubble to gamble on rising land. It came in the wake of a downturn to take over a project whose Australian owner had run out of money to build it. By the time Japan's asset boom arrived and Bond built the famous empire that would make and then break him, Yanchep had been out of his hands for years, and it was Tokyo, not Bond, who owned Neptune and the dolphins and the marina. The new owner had a different idea of what the place was for. Bond had sold Yanchep as a city, a second Perth for as many as 250,000 people. Tokyo quietly let that ambition go and turned the emphasis towards something smaller and more achievable. A tourist resort on the coast, a destination rather than a metropolis. The dream of a city was not so much abandoned as set down, and the place went on under Japanese ownership as a holiday coast with a marine park at its heart, a far more modest thing than the one that had been drawn on the brochures, and Bond, for his part, sailed on toward the ruin that was waiting for him. The cup he had brought home in 1983 was to be defended off the Western Australian coast in 1987 at Fremantle, down the shore from the marina he no longer owned, and he could not even win the right to defend it. In the trials held to choose the Australian boat, Bond's syndicate was beaten by another Australian crew, sailing a yacht called Kookaburra, and it was that crew, not his, that went out to meet the Americans. They lost. The cup that Bond had prized out of American hands 4 years before went straight back to them, and the man who had won it was not even on the water when it left. The two great dreams that had made his name on that coast had, by then, both escaped him. The city had gone to a company in Tokyo, sold off in a downturn a decade before anyone thought to ask who owned it. The cup had gone back to the Americans, lost in a set of trials at Fremantle to a boat that was not his. And the sea god at Yanchep, the 10-meter king who had been raised to crown the whole ambition, now presided over a coast that belonged to other men, staring out over the water for a builder who was no longer there to see him. Chapter 8. Lights Out. At the end of the 1980s, the lights over Neptune's kingdom began, one by one, to go out. In August of 1990, the Japanese company Tokyo closed Atlantis Marine Park. And the reasons were the ordinary reasons that close such places. The crowds that had once driven up the coast to watch the dolphins had thinned year on year. The park had been losing money for a long time, and a new set of rules on the keeping of marine mammals now required an enclosure far larger than anything the old pools at Two Rocks could be made into. It was cheaper to shut the gates than to build the sea the law now demanded, so the gates shut. And a question that no one had troubled to ask when the dolphins were caught became all at once urgent. What was to be done with them now? That was the hardest part of the ending, and it did not end well. The animals had been taken from this coast in 1981 to perform. Now, a decade on, the plan was to give them back to it. After a program of rehabilitation meant to teach captive dolphins to hunt and survive again, they were released to the wild in January of 1992. It went badly. Some of them, by most accounts, lost condition quickly, unable or unwilling to feed themselves in an ocean they had been taken from young and had not swum free in for years. 3 were recaptured, judged unable to make their own way, and moved to another aquarium down the coast. There, by most accounts, all 3 died in 1999, 2 of them poisoned, by a source that was never established. It was not a mystery to be dwelt on. It was a well-meant release that became quietly a welfare tragedy and it closed the story of the dolphins on a note no one had intended and no one could undo. And in the same handful of years, the man who had drawn the whole thing on a brochure came down harder than any of it. Bond had long since left Yanchep, but he had not stopped building, and by the late 1980s his empire was one of the largest in the country. Then it fell. Bond Corporation collapsed in 1991 under debts counted in the billions, a failure so vast it took years simply to account for. In 1992 he was declared bankrupt. And in 1997, after years of investigation, he pleaded guilty to draining more than $1 billion out of one of his own companies, the largest corporate fraud the country had ever seen, and was sent to prison for it. The larrikin hero who had beaten the Americans at their own game, the self-made man who had wanted to build things large enough to be seen from the sky, finished this part of the story as a convicted fraudster in a cell. He was released in 2000 after serving some 4 years, and he lived another 15. A diminished and contested figure, neither wholly forgiven nor wholly condemned, until his death in 2015. By then, almost nothing of the story tied back to him in any obvious way. The city he had announced was not built. The park he had inspired was shut and rotting. The dolphins were dead. The cup he had brought home had long since gone back across the ocean. What remained on that stretch of coast was not a monument to a tycoon, but a set of abandoned things he had set in motion and then let go of. A marina without its city, a marine park without its animals, and a 10-meter god still standing on the beach staring out at an empty sea, waiting for crowds that were never going to come again. Chapter 9. The God in the Weeds. What Bond and Tokyo left behind at Yanchep was not a city, and not even the ruin of one. It was a landscape of things that had been started and then abandoned where they stood. The dolphin park was the clearest of them. Behind its fences, the buildings began to rot in the salt air, the paint going, the roofs failing, and the pools where the dolphins had performed filled slowly with rainwater and algae until they sat there green and still, a row of bright, stagnant rectangles baking in the sun. Nothing moved in them. The whole place held the particular silence of somewhere built for crowds and then emptied of them, a stadium after the last game, keeping the shape of an event that was never coming back. The marina told the same story in a quieter register. It had been cut into the coast to serve a city of 250,000 people. It served instead a town that could be counted in the low thousands. The basin and the canals were real and solid and permanent, a genuine piece of engineering that had cost real money and real effort. And around them lay not a metropolis, but a scatter of houses, a small shopping centre, a great deal of empty ground where streets had been drawn and never laid. The infrastructure of a city sat waiting for the city, and the city did not come. Boats used the harbour, the dunes behind it stayed dunes. And presiding over all of it, in the scrub behind his own fences, stood King Neptune, the 10-meter god who had been the emblem of the whole dream, trident raised, staring out over the ocean he was meant to rule, now weathered slowly in the coastal weather, his concrete and limestone cracking, his colours fading. Over the years he was covered in graffiti, tag upon tag sprayed across the sea god and the lesser figures of his ruined court, until the great faces in the weeds looked less like the centrepiece of a marine park than the relic of some lost and half-remembered religion. He went on staring out to sea, exactly as he had been built to do, above a car park where no crowds parked and a coast that no longer brought them. Around all this, the essential thing that did not happen was the city. The metropolis Bond had announced with such noise in 1972 simply did not arrive. Year after year, Yanchep and Two Rocks stayed small and half-finished, too far up the coast to be an easy suburb of Perth and too incomplete to be a city of their own. A place people drove through on the way to the national park or the beach, glancing at the strange graffitied god in the scrub, and drove on. The promise had been total. The delivery was a marina, a handful of streets, and a statue. The gap between the two sat there in the open for anyone to see, mile after mile of surveyed emptiness where 250,000 people were supposed to live. But the people who did live there were not a punchline, and they did not treat their town as one. They were real families in a real place, raising children in the half-built edges of a cancelled dream. And what defined them more than anything was patience. They waited. They waited through the closing of the park and the release of the dolphins, and the slow vandalizing of Neptune. They waited while the promised city stayed on the drawing board, and the years turned into decades. For something close to 30 years, the most striking thing on that whole stretch of coast was the sight of a graffitied sea god, 10 meters tall, standing in the weeds above an empty car park. A monument, if it was a monument to anything, to a future that had been drawn in perfect detail and then quietly cancelled, over a town that had been told to expect a city and told instead to wait. Chapter 10. The City, 50 years late. And then, slowly and by other hands, the things Bond had abandoned began to be reclaimed. First, the god himself. In 2006, King Neptune was placed on the Heritage Register. No longer an embarrassment to be pulled down, but a thing worth keeping, a genuine piece of the state's strange history. And in 2015, the statue was cleaned and restored, the graffiti scrubbed away, the cracked concrete and limestone repaired, the 10-meter sea god made presentable again, and returned more or less to the way he had looked staring out over the crowds in 1981. In the years that followed, the wider Sun City precinct around him, the marina, the shopping centre, the old Atlantis site, was placed on the state's register of heritage places. The whole failed kingdom formally recognised as something to be remembered rather than forgotten. But the restoration of a statue was not the city, and the real change, when it came, had nothing to do with Neptune at all. It came in July of 2024, and it came on rails. After half a century of promises, a railway line finally reached Yanchep. 14.5 kilometres of new track running north up the coast, 3 new stations along it, and at the end of it, a run of about 49 minutes into the centre of Perth. It was the thing that had been missing all along. Not a spectacle, not a god, not a marina, but the plain infrastructure that turns a distant town into a place where people can actually live and still get to work. Bond had built the marina first, and the dolphins next, and the god above them all, and none of it had made the city come. The trains made it come. And once the trains came, so did everyone else. The suburbs that had waited 50 years to be built began, at last, to be built, spreading out across the surveyed emptiness behind the coast, and the people arrived in the tens of thousands. A town that had held about 2,000 souls at the turn of the century swelled over the following years toward the size it had first been promised. A genuine outer city of Perth, filling in the ground that Bond had drawn on a brochure and could not sell. The metropolis he had announced in 1972 was arriving in the 2020s, on schedule for no plan he had ever made. Under no name he would have recognized, as though the city had simply been waiting for the right decade and the right piece of track, and had never needed him at all. So the second Perth came in the end. It just came about 50 years late, and it came without the tycoon. And it came as an ordinary thing. Not a sunshine playground or a mythic kingdom by the sea, but suburbs and stations and commuters. The unglamorous furniture of a city that works. Above them, on his restored plinth in the heritage-listed scrub, King Neptune still stands, trident raised over the marina and the growing town, cleaned and catalogued and preserved, the last surviving god of a kingdom that failed, presiding now over the plain, real suburbs that finally arrived without him. And down at the new station, a train pulls in from Perth and opens its doors, and the platform fills with people coming home. Commuters and families and schoolchildren, tens of thousands of them across the town, almost none of whom have ever heard the name of the man who drew the whole thing on a brochure half a century ago, and lost it before it was built. What does a man leave behind, in the end, when the city he imagined arrives 50 years after his fall, arrives on its own terms, under its own name, and does not remember it was ever his dream?